ASTM to other ASTM standards, which we have used to develop our national standard. So our national standard, TTS 598 2018, is largely an adoption of these two standards, with input from other standards, because Trinidad also imports steel from Australia and other countries. So we would have included content from those other standards, but it's largely based on these two ASTM standards, the 8924 and 8653. This is another example showing the relationship between the building codes and standards. So this shows the US system. You would recall, as I indicated, you have the national, at the US level, there are state and city regulations, which refer to a building code like the IBC. The IBC is sort of like an umbrella document. It contains requirements, but in many cases it refers you to other documents. So in this case, for concrete construction, it refers you to a document called the ACI 318, building requirements for structural concrete. So that tells the designer which concrete to use, how to design it, what strength to specify, etc. The actual requirement for ready-mix concrete is the standard here, ASTM C94, which in turn refers to all these other ASTM standards for various things. So there are several standards for cement, several standards for aggregate, several standards for the admixes. There's even a standard for the water. Yeah. And of course, we know that reinforced concrete is the concrete plus the steel bars. So there are several standards for the rebar as well. This is the US system. This here is the Trinidad equivalent at this time. Well, when the standard is completed. So you have at the head, the top requirements being set by the Ministry of Works and Transport's Structural Design Guidelines, which refers to the IBC 2009, which in turn refers to the ACI 318. We have the similar configuration of the ready-mix standard and the supporting the other constituents, standards for the constituent materials and the standard for the steel. Where the standards are in black, we have Trinidad and Tobago equivalents for them. Most of our standards, though, were largely almost full adoptions of the American standards. So you'd see our national standard, TTCS 8, steel bars for concrete reinforcement, basically is an adoption of all the rebar standards specified by the governing ACI 318. We have a standard for cement, and we're currently, as I indicated, finalizing the standard for ready-mix concrete. So this is just to show the relationship between the individual product standards, the codes, and the governing requirements. So this is an example of one of our public standards, which is available from our web store and the view from the standards database. It has some bibliographic information. Also important is the scope of the standard, which it tells you the types of products covered by the standard and what it applies to, and also what it doesn't apply to. So when you have some time, feel free to check it out and get some more information about individual standards. And as I close, I just want to highlight some of the enforcement activities. So we have a mandatory product certification scheme, and product certification basically involves assessment of the production, the manufacturing facility. So we require no inspections of the facility, the equipment, and look at the management system, look at the quality control systems to ensure that the products are they have the capability of consistently producing quality products. And the TTBS will take samples of the products of the production line and test it to ensure that they comply with the standard. Once they satisfy these things, we will issue a quality mark. And this is an example of the quality mark here. So we have that in place right now for hollow-clay, well, we're developing it for hollow-clay blocks, but it's in place for roofing sheets, cold form premium members, and being developed for concrete blocks. For products that are imported, well, is actually cement sometimes imported, but it's now nothing actually manufactured. But for the steel bars and the hot rolled steel products, TTBS would inspect the products on the port and take a sample of the rebars and bring it to our labs for testing. And by this way, we ensure that we keep construction products satisfy their intended, the stated requirements, and therefore will fit within the building code systems and meet the requirements that they are intended to meet. Right, so there's a bit more here about product certification, and it provides insurance that products comply with specified requirements. It depends on testing, inspection, assessment of the quality management systems, and taking products off the shelf for the market, open market, to verify that they satisfy. These links will take you to, and this is from the TTBS website. You could see a list of all the certified profit sheet and Freeman member suppliers. And this is the end of my presentation, and I want to thank you for your time and attention. I'll answer any questions that you have, and you can also feel free to contact me subsequently with this email address and this phone number. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Quite an informative presentation. So now we have our next speaker, Dr. Anand Prasad. Dr. Prasad pursued postdoctoral studies in 2001 to 2003 at the University of Florida, Gainesville, on invasive species and development of molecular tools, including high-fidelity PCR. He has a PhD from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad, in invertebrate ecology and entomology. Dr. Prasad actively collaborates with a multidisciplinary international team of researchers focused on industry-based research in arboriculture, tree biomechanics, and pollinator health, and is interested in incorporation of artificial intelligence, geospatial analytics, and human and social governance aspects of innovation in green space health. As chair of the UAA Research Committee, Dr. Prasad has focused on creating partnerships with other organizations to build on and leverage cross-industry research and enhance funding opportunities. He maintains a connected network of state and federal agencies, as well as international collaborators, including small island states. He has been an avid researcher and educator in the field of arboriculture in a changing world for over 15 years, and an invited speaker to numerous International Society of Arboriculture chapter meetings, the ISA National Meetings, the ISA Biomechanics Weeks, and the Utility Arborist Association meeting, along with several related international events. He is the 2021 recipient of the ISA National L.C. Chadwick Research Award in Arboriculture. Let us welcome Dr. Anand Prasad.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to attempt some screen sharing now, and let me know when it's up and running, Kellen. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Prasad. Yes, your slides are visible.
Okay, great. So, you know, following up on that interesting talk on standards, one of the things that governs trees and hazards is we have a multitude of standards that we operate with in North America, and that's not part of the discussion today, because in the 30 or so minutes that I have, what I wanted to do was to provide an overview on hazard tree recognition and mitigation at a high level, and a little bit on what we can do in Trinidad and Tobago to offset and counter some of, or to make our urban forestry programs climate resilient, especially in the face of some of the more erratic weather systems we are seeing, heavy rain, standing water, wind, and we are, as a speaker before me said, hurricane season is almost upon us. So on my cover slide, there's a tree tip over, and I believe that's a pui. And then up top, there's a balata that has a failure, basal tree failure. Typically, these fail about 1 meter from the ground. And we'll get into that sort of in the rubric around that as we progress. So to frame the discussion, Trinidad is is an island in the Caribbean, as we know. And it's subject to a lot of visible impact of, climate change. We estimate, global seas are rising, and we know that the infringement and encroachment of salt water into groundwater supplies in coastal areas is something that occurs. And this does impact on the vegetation, the trees. It does impact to the level of, causing secondary issues, bringing in pests and so forth, and the stress factor, and of course, tree mortality. So in these many bullets here, I want to focus on the impact of, climate change and how we can be climate resilient in our urban tree programs. This is a screenshot of Port of Spain, and you can see it's pretty green. There's a lot of green growing there, and one wonders about, groundwater and so forth. We realize trees exist a whole lot more when they become a hazard and they fail during storms. Trinidad is a very green place. You drive around and there are trees everywhere. When we started to think about stability, tree stability, and we started to think about the impact of tree failure is when there is one. So in cases where, I work closely with the horticultural services in Trinidad, and Mr. Govaya, who's on this call, is a valued collaborator, along with Mr. Rishi Singh from the Ministry of Agriculture as well. And these are things that, that we observe, that I've observed on my many visits to Trinidad. I'm there in another 6-8 weeks, I'll be back there. And some of the things that you notice would be standing water, in a pasture situation. And that's not very good for trees. It suffocates the roots. Trees do need air in their root systems. And standing water is not good. It kills the fine roots, and the trees start having dieback situations. So if you have in urban, peri-urban areas, you have standing water, no, it's not a very good thing for trees. This is a royal palm that failed, near the Queen's Park Savannah, not too long after I did a safety meeting on hazard trees. And then there is some data on Irma and Maria from up the chain, further up the island chain, that I'll talk about in a little bit. And this here is a water pipe that burst but saturated the soil, same way as heavy rain. But then a wind blew, and then down, the tree just flipped over because of the massive, dense canopy you have. And these are some of the things we're going to sort of talk about during my presentation. In North America, we have tornadoes here, as you know, and tornadoes snap trees a little bit higher up. We call it tree snap, and they go about 2-3 meters up, a little bit different from a basal failure. But these impact, as you know, a lot of homes and houses, and statistically, we have a lot of fatalities with tree-related events on buildings and infrastructure than we do on the buildings themselves. So, while we want to have green spaces, while we want to enjoy green spaces, we need to understand more. We need to be clinical in our assessments, and we need to be a lot more proactive in our management, especially as we are getting high wind events a whole lot more regularly. We've seen more. We've seen rainfall heavier than normal, and so on. And of course, up here we have snow and ice to deal with. So let's start the discussion, and I'd like to think it's a discussion because I know we can have a lot of follow-up from this webinar over emails and so forth. But the idea of right tree, right place is something that should not be lost upon us. I work a lot in the Western Pacific with islanders in WAB, Saipan, Rota, Guam, and one of the things that's very, very relevant in the frontline states, as I call them, because they see and they are not front of climate change. They're seeing that rise. They're seeing the salt water. They're seeing the trees in decline, but they also seeing the resiliency on the other side of the, on the other side of the game. They're seeing the resiliency that trees can provide and the enjoyment that they can provide if they're in the right place. So if you had a house, you wanted to grade your trees in height away from the house, as the chart shows. So you want to have foundation plants, and you want to offset. And if you have a particularly large piece of land, you don't want to have anything, larger than 15, 20 feet within 50 feet of the house. And as you feather out, you can go a little bit higher up and have, into your woods and so forth. But the idea of right tree, right place is one that is always lost upon a lot of places that I see in Europe, in North America, small islands, everywhere. Right tree, right place is something that we need to adhere to more strongly, because climate resiliency and the need for climate resiliency is making that very more apparent. For example, these are dwarf palms. These were planted as dwarf palms in Guam below a power line, and it was assumed that they would get up to 6 to 8 feet. So these are what I like to call giant dwarfs then, because they didn't remain small. And that's something that you find in genetic material and so forth. So sometimes you buy a dwarf plant, it goes up, and it defeats the purpose. So eventually all these are going to have to go because they get into the power lines and would affect utility, cause outages and so on. So let's flip it and let's talk about wrong tree, wrong place. I have a picture here, and everything that can go wrong will go wrong with this situation. You have a pretty large tree here, and my friend Johan could probably identify that a whole lot better than I can. And it's right up against a house, which no doubt has people living in there. We know there is electricity in the house. We see wires connected. We see wires, distribution lines going up, probably passing through the tree as well. And what worries me the most is the human life, really. So we deal with, the outage situation, but the human life, and of course the structure. Even if the people are not home and you have some untoward incident, then they lose their place of living. So we can identify the targets: human life, infrastructure, buildings, but the hazards is something that the hazards would be the one that we want to really start figuring out, and I've worked with Trinidad in terms of working with the Hot Services staff. We have been able to have a few pilot programs in place that are starting to do that, identify hazards. We have equipment Hot Services acquired, resistograph, which is resistograph, for example, which you can do to get an idea of decay pits in trees and so forth. So we know the target. It's everything that's near and dear to us, and it's infrastructure. Of course, it's it's our ability to travel from point A to B unhindered. Tree across the road, never a good thing. Tree on the power line, never a good thing. So we know our targets. Even lately in North America, we've had a lot of pets being featured. Like in the rural areas, dog houses and so forth become more blatantly targets than before. But what are they? So we know the targets. So let's talk about hazards. Now, hazards is something you're sitting below this tree having a coffee or whatnot, and you don't think of it as a hazard. You're enjoying the canopy up above, but this is a hazard waiting to happen. And hazards, I want to say, are not always apparent. So if you think in this talk, I was going to show you a bunch of trees with a bunch of holes and, and fail, that that's apparent. What I want to talk about is the stuff that's hidden and how we can design urban forestry programs to capture and identify these hidden issues, and how can we mitigate against it. So to begin, someone mentioned overgrown trees. I like that because that tells you right away that it's wrong tree, wrong place. If you have to have an overgrown tree as a problem, then that tree shouldn't have been there. So in this picture, for example, all these trees are hazards. Eventually they are stressed. They're going to succumb to branch loss. They're going to succumb to, wood rot and so forth. And they're eventually going to have a break point. They're going to have wind loading. They're going to have saturation, and they're going to tip over, or they're going to fail in some way. So the idea is restricted root spaces on city sidewalks are an issue for larger trees. If you have these, then put in shrubs, put in small ecosystem plants, put in crepe myrtles or something that would not need that huge, that would not have a need for a huge root zone. Another area of, these hidden hazards, are water and wind combination. I mentioned that, and this is what I see a lot in Trinidad. The ground gets saturated, the wind comes in, there is a lot of sail up top in the canopy, and down goes the tree. And then you realize the root plate. A lot of people think that trees have a big old tap root that's going to anchor it in place, but not really. A lot of trees grow within the first 18 inches of soil. And whether it's in Trinidad or Europe or North America, it's something that's commonplace. So the failure of trees when you have no visual defects. So so we are learning here through our track programs and so forth. We have this program in North America called TRACK, where people are trained. They have to work in the industry for a certain number of years. I think it's 5-6 years. They take them, they put them through these high level training program to detect defects and so forth. And in a study, and this has been going on for at least a decade or so, they took 20 agents that had served in the field. They were qualified and served in the field, and they put them through a park. And the reports that came back were chalk and cheese apart with every single agent. So it's like an ink blood test almost. So again, you want to subscribe to standards, but when it comes to biological entities and the human mind looking at things, you have a lot of wiggle room in there to not have not to fly information, I want to say. So that's something that we try to work on, and I'm on the innovation end. And what I'm trying to do in the industry is really come up with metrics that can guide us throughout globally on some of these hidden aspects that would result in a hazard. So we know, utility type pruning, you prune so the wire can have a place, and there's a lot of places around the world where where utilities and tree conflicts occur. You solve that by putting the utilities underground. It's a huge expense, but after I think World War II, Europe learned that, and a lot of utilities are underground. So Europe is ahead of the game. But that's one way, to minimize tree utility conflict. Then you have massive cuts on trees that leads to defects eventually. And these are, causative agents that we do in our management, because this limb should have been pruned out when it was like a fingernail and not when it got to a finger, if I may use that analogy. So one of the things in climate resiliency programs is that you want to be ahead of the game. And for younger trees that go in the ground, you want to start pruning them very early so that your pruning cuts heal and you don't have defects. So let's talk a little bit about the different types of failure that were after a windstorm that we see. This is called a torsional break, very classic the wind spins the wood, and wood handles static loading in different directions pretty good. When it comes to rotational forces, wood doesn't do a good job. And that's why trees break very easily in tornadoes. And if the wind in a hurricane or high wind event changes direction, the trees snap a whole lot faster. This is a branch in the back of my truck that hit a 69 kV line and caught fire, and it snapped on a branch color that came from a tree that was pruned here this was in I believe in the Florida area. But you can see somewhere along the line, somebody made a pruning cut here, a utility linesman. This is the branch that was attached. This is what we call the stem union with the stem or the branch collar. Eventually what happened is this is a water sprout that came out from here and grew and escaped further action. If this was addressed, this water sprout was addressed, then this weight would not have been here. You'd have had a better fulcrum. The branch may not have snapped, and then that outage would not have occurred. But this branch is absolutely toast. Included bark. I see a whole lot in tropical trees, and this is because trees grow quickly. It's like putting your two thumbs together and having that skin below, and you can pull that apart. And what happens in included bark is that there is bark in the structure of a joint. And as you walk around, if you see that, it starts to fissure and crack. And as a tree grows, eventually splits. Some of the basal failure occur from hidden cavities that you may or may not see. This is a classic wind throw, and I believe this is Pui, and in Trinidad, I believe it's in somewhere in the Savannah or Port of Spain, but Johan can correct me there. So this is weather saturated and wind throw. Large tree, whole tree failure. For a tree this big, it's been in the ground 50, 60 years, and yet it failed because the conditions became ripe for it to fall. And the question becomes, how do we manage for these in a changing environment? This happened yesterday, I believe. Johan sent me this picture. This is a sandbox tree, and there is a high amount of wood rot in the tree, and there is some decay. And wood rot is something that you can see sometimes, and sometimes it's within the cavities of the trees, and you don't pick it up. And the types of wood decay that I see a lot, I see white rot in Trinidad a lot in high water areas. And this is, the tree starts to lose bark at the base. Sorry about this. The wood starts to feel soft and spongy because the lignin is the strength support, the lignin that supports the wood cell starts to go. And eventually you have dieback and the tree will fail. Brown rot, a little less common, more in pines. You find this in hardwoods in North America. Soft rot I see in Trinidad as well. And these are just softwood decay pockets, and they attack cellulose. Imagine it as it were that you have a mighty tree, but inside the tree, this is what's going on, because you have a small opening or wound from a string trimmer. You had a small opening or wound from an old pruning cut. You might have had some kind of, a car run into the tree or something, but you have an opening, and then you have, these rod that causes a significant loss. And this is what we call loss in biomechanical stability of the tree. Tree loses structure. And these rods are almost always identified, sometimes with mushrooms being present, may or may not be present. So what are the contributors to some of these hidden that causes these rods and these hazards? Mechanical injury, we have, I like to say in these islands of the Pacific, we have teams upon teams, I notice out there every time, all year round, of what we call lawn ninjas. And they're like guys with weed whackers out there. Basically, all you can see are their eyes, and they're doing right up on the trees, and they are weed whacking. You know, so lawnmowers, string trimmers, these are some of the things that'll cause migration of rot in our urban trees, and lead to eventually trunk damage that'll spread. It wouldn't go away, it wouldn't heal itself. There are things you can do if you have a damaged tree, bark tracing and so forth, to assist the tree in healing. But dieback and death is almost always going to follow. So the idea is you have to start to think proactively. If you want to enjoy your urban forest, you want to enjoy your trees, you can't have your grass grow up against your tree. As simple as that. If you maintain a buffer of mulch or or whatever around that tree or area around that tree, the lawn ninjas aren't going to go up against it. All right. The other one of the big things in Trinidad is the bathtub effect, and we did this test in the believe at the Queen's Park Savannah. I think we did this test, and we were planting a tree, and we filled a pool of water to look at at the drainage, and you have to look at drainage of the site before you put a tree in. It should look like this when you put water in. It should percolate after about 1 to 3 hours. It should look like this, not remain filled with water. If it remains filled with water, your tree is going to be planted in standing water, and it's going to lead to rot eventually, root suffocation, and eventually death and a hazardous situation. So you need to minimize the risk associated with some of these hazards. So restricted root spaces occur. How do we, we identify trees in planting pits as potential issues, unless you have a tree that can grow in a smaller space that's suitable. Girdling roots are some things I see in Trinidad. Has a lot to do with compaction, and you'll see exactly what I talk about compaction. We have a lot of vehicles that drive over root zones in Trinidad, and you technically should not be operating a motor vehicle over a tree root zone, which is equivalent to the canopy and more. So if you look up and you look at a tree canopy, you shouldn't be parking a car up against that tree, or you shouldn't be driving across, because you compact the soil, the growing roots hit it, and suddenly what happens is the roots start to encircle, and eventually they strangle the tree. And I see this a lot, in Trinidad. It's called compaction issues, and you may or may not see an effect on the tree, but eventually the tree is going to fail because of that girdling root situation. So there are mitigation measures you can use for the thing in your management program, and these are some of the things that you want to implement. So it's getting to the point where it is to the point actually in urban forestry in Trinidad, whereby if you want to enjoy that green space, you have to be a whole lot more clinical, because there are things that can be done to sort of remediate or mitigate. For example, construction injury. I see this a lot on trees in Trinidad, where you're building a house, but you're running the equipment over the root plates, over the tree roots. And that kills the tree, because what you're doing is you're putting something that's going to take Mother Nature. When you drive like a piece of machinery over the soil, it's going to take Mother Nature thousands of years to get that soil back, believe it or not, to where it was before. That spongy, earthy soil is now compacted, and it'll take mycorrhizae, roots. It's going to take a lot of work for that soil to get back to where it was before. So think about that when heavy machinery, ditches and drainage and so forth are made up against trees. There is something called a tree protection area, tree protection zones that you put around mature trees, and you measure it. I know it happens a lot in North America, where the construction folks would still lift the fencing up and pass the equipment through and put it back down. They've been caught many times. So the idea is root destruction makes for hazardous situation. Excess fill around the trees. If you backfill, that's a common thing. People backfill around trees. You don't, because that tree needs air, believe it or not, in the root system. And compaction. I think one of the biggest issues we have in trees is that compaction. you know, this is just a site in Guam where wild pigs are going to take these big trees out. These trees have been around, you know, some of them for 80 years. And climate change has brought in the huge numbers of wild pigs are doing a whole lot better in some of these islands now. And they get into the root zone to chew the roots out, and a big issue. This is something that we have in Trinidad too. This is a cutlass chop on a tree. This is in Wab. Somebody decided they didn't like this coconut tree in this place, and they chopped out a piece. That's vandalism. So we call that abiotic when you have abiotic hazards happening. And you can see probably test marks on the tree here, but that's never a good thing when you have these mechanical abiotic that factors that will affect roots tree stability. This isn't Cora. This is on Saipan. So it seems to be a global issue of people deciding to cook near a tree cavity, and this makes for a hazard situation. I don't know if you all remember, we had probably a case in Trinidad where a tree failed and killed a lady, I believe, up near one of them, near one of the areas a few years back. But you know, that's wound causing drought. The tree can't get moisture, canopy dies. It's a week, it's gonna fall over. And you know, and you throw vandalism into there. You know, so these are things we can no longer tolerate. We need to build zero tolerance into these situations. You know, wounds cause water stress. That's one of the things you want to remember. So as you walk around and you find a wound on a tree, know that tree isn't getting the moisture it needs to get, whether it's man-made, whether it's accident, or however. These string trimmers on small trees, because the grass is up against the tree again, is going to lead to big wounds as the tree grows, even if it survives. Street trees need to be protected from vehicular damage. If we want to have trees, as a UE student, I remember, you know, the pui will be flowering and we know it's exam, because if that pui flower and you study that, you know you're in trouble. But the thing about the pui is that they throw a lot of flowers on the roadway, and then people would skid after a rain, and you know you'd have a little bit of a wreck. So the idea is nowhere, again, right tree, right place, know the characteristics of the tree, where you're going to put it. So you know, you don't have to have the downstream conflicts. So let's talk a little bit about inspection and mitigation, because urban forests are really cool. This is London, and in a hot day, many of us know that you could sit down, enjoy your doubles underneath a tree, you know, sip a cup of tea, coffee underneath a tree and enjoy it. So right tree, right place. These are smaller, probably leaf linden in London. They ain't gonna get bigger than where they are. And they have been what is called crown lifted. So a regular human being can walk under the trees and not have a branch conflict now or later on. And you know, and there is an element of, you know, but it calls for an element of management. These trees are growing in restricted root spaces, but they're built for that. These species can handle and tolerate these smaller pits. And also below ground, there are below ground pits that some cities are installing that allow for that root plate to grow and stabilize the tree. So when we talk about inspection on a tree, and ISA, you know, has divided trees, you know, into several regions, and this is just an overview: crown, stem, and root. So in a big picture, a tree has a crown, the branches, the lateral branches and the upper terminal branches. It has a stem, and then which is the trunk basically, and then you have a root system made up of root collar, flare, and then the root plate basically. I was at an event in DC, and went out to get something from my car. I was coming back in, and I noticed something wasn't looking right from the time I had gotten to this event, and 1 hour later, something just wasn't looking right on a tree plate, on a root plate below the tree. And I thought it was like, it looked as if it had lifted a little bit. Went there and was able to stick my foot underneath the root plate, that tree was starting to tip. We had to evacuate the house that this event was being held at because that tree was coming down. That tree would have come down and, you know, there were 20, 30 people inside of the house at the time. So these are not things, you know, limited to Trinidad only. These are events that occur throughout the world. So in your inspection, start with the root plate. What you can start with the low-hanging fruit. Look at the root plate. It should be level. There should be no areas of lift. If there are areas of lift that, you know, that you can stick your foot in, or even you're seeing plants being uprooted around the edges, that tree is starting to go. And sometimes they go suddenly and sometimes they go over a few days. This root color area here should be nice. You should see flares like fingers on the soil, and there should be no rot, no insect damage, no mower damage, etc. visible. As you work your way up the stem, there should be no holes in the stem, no you know, flaking bark and so forth. And then you look at the stem branch union, and there is something called aspect ratio. And an aspect ratio is simply the ratio of this stem, this branch, to the trunk, or where it's attached. And a branch, the diameter of a branch should be smaller than the diameter of the trunk for it to be a healthy branch union. If this were bigger than the trunk or about the same size, then you're approaching a hazard. So a hazard is not always having a hole in a tree. So these risk assessments, based on sight, based on what we know, how trees behave, based on the visual cues that may or may not be present, you know, are some cues that lead to risk, that gives us some sort of idea of risk. And that alone is a one-day seminar. But the question for us is, how does management help us? So the first thing we want to do is to start thinking of, when you look at trees, they are money in the bank, they are structural assets. Look at trees differently as you walk out the room you're in, and look at the tree and look at it as a structural asset that you want to preserve, that you want to maybe even remove, get out of it if it's a bad investment. If it's a tree, and plant two more. So, you know, appreciate the tree form, the adaptability to the site, right tree, right place. If it's the wrong tree, wrong place, don't keep, you know, nurturing it, because a hazard is going to develop and eventually you're going to have loss. So look at things like aspect ratios, included bark, we mentioned earlier. And this would be included bark. Aspect ratios would be size of branch to stem, and included bark here again. And start building structural assets in your the urban forest, and avoid an investment in tree, taking care of a tree that's going to fail because, you know, there's included bark or there's some inherent issue. Avoid, you know, this is something we see a lot, you know, tree topping, but this is going to lead to water sprouts. Eventually the sprouts are very heavy. It's going to lead to fracture because it's also a weak union. A water sprout is a heavy part of a branch. It's a heavy branch, and it's a weak union. So when that is recipe for failure. And that is caused by what we call topping, where trees are cut and there is a huge stub left behind. Some of the visible, you know, cracks we see are signs of weakness. So you want to prune this out right away. This should not be, you know, in the environment. You know, this is a hazard waiting to happen here. Obviously, you got a large branch stem ratio. So this is not going to end happily for this tree. And to add to that, there is obviously a crack there. So I'm not an advocate of taking the tree out, but start taking some of the weight out, maybe at the end of the branches or the bigger branches themselves. Broken branches in storm, obviously a hanging branch. You know, some folks up in Canada call these widowmakers. They exist everywhere after a rain, but you got to look up and you got to, you know, do an assessment. So mitigation, preventative pruning. So for these mature trees or overgrown trees, preventative maintenance today, preventative pruning today limits your hazard issues tomorrow. You got to execute a good pruning plan. So for disaster preparedness, I want to say you have to prepare not just for a wind event and look at how many trees are going to come out of the ground, but leapfrog that and go to where the new trees have been planted and try to influence it from there. Think ahead, and act appropriately. Pruning is one tool we have to use in the urban systems to minimize the amount of canopy we have. Simply because in a forest setting, the trees determine the size of the canopy from the competition and so forth. So they restrict how much they grow. In the urban environment, that's why we have overgrown trees, because they're not shaped by competition. So these are, just pruning cuts on how you'd make a pruning cut. A cut is outside of this area here, rich in nutrients that help heal the tree. If you cut into this, you're going to allow pathogens in, leading to rot, like we saw with the sandbox tree. And this is just a diagram of what we know about proper pruning cuts in trees. So you can go from picture on your left to the picture on your right. What you've done here is limit the amount of sail. So the wind is going to be this tree is going to handle itself a little bit better in the wind. This tree is not. You want to avoid this, and I see this, we see this a lot in our saman and flamboyant trees in Trinidad, where we did not take the branches off when the trees were younger, and we probably did when they were older, and this is not going to be end happily for this tree or the target. So far we know there's a fence there. We don't know what's on the other side. So the idea is to start thinking about integration. As you go towards mitigation, as you take some of these hazardous trees out, start thinking about communities and ecosystem, and start looking at what's going on in the ecosystem around here. And you find that that a mix of trees is always better. When you have plant families, shapes, leaves, and forms, they're going to have different tolerances to wind and rain and so forth, and they're going to lend support to each other. You're going to have strong, you're going to have weak, and they're going to lend support to each other. Some of these leaves are formulated to handle water runoff, a whole lot better than some. So when you mix things, and some can handle wind better than others, so you get structural assets and diversity. So I mentioned structural assets first. I want to add to that a layer of diversity. So if you drive through on your way home, you should see a diverse amount of different shapes in your trees and your leaves. And that starts to speak to biomechanical, a sense of biomechanical responsibility. This is just as you plant trees. This is in India, ecosystem planting and establishment. Trees lend support to each other. Eventually there's going to be competition in here, but they're going to shape each other and they're going to be pretty strong. So let's start thinking about ecosystem type planted. This is what a properly executed ecosystem. This survived a typhoon. This is in Tumon Bay in Guam, and it survived a typhoon. So you have a flamboyant, they call it flame tree over there. Coconut palm didn't do too well. We lost a couple coconut trees, but you have a mix, textures and so forth planted as a community, and people are enjoying it. There are people here in the pavilions, and they're having a blast. And you can enjoy the trees. These trees ain't gonna get much bigger than the height they have here. There's an ironwood tree off to the side here, and ironwood is a pioneer species in Trinidad. But the idea is you can have a little bit of color. You can get your stability and have a climate ready system if you explore and adapt your urban trees. There's a utility line, believe it or not, somewhere through here as well, or nearby. These are trees on a research station on Guam, on the University of Guam, and You know, you had coconut palms on one side. They lost about 50% of the coconut palms in a typhoon. They didn't lose a whole lot of these trees, the deciduous trees on this end. So trees, look at what's growing, and you know, and they grow best where they do good. Encourage right tree, right place. Avoid what we call over pruning and sharing in Trinidad. So we got to get away from the machete hacking that we do and start to think about proper pruning, because we do have a lot of chainsaws in Trinidad. We just got to have people trained to do proper pruning. You know, plant in ecosystem arrangements when we can, you know, think about root conditioning a little more. Trees are climate ready, yes, but they need the help. And this is a point of failure study that was done back in 2017. And you notice, so these bars are simply number of trees with failure and different types of failure. So the blue is branch failure, the orange is stem, and the gray is basal failure, or some of the breaking points you saw earlier. And I don't have a whole lot of graphs, so bear with me on this one, but this one's important because this shows that guava, you know, there wasn't a single failed tree in guava after Irma and Maria anywhere in the island. There was guava trees, but not a single one failed. I mean, they may have lost some branches and stuff. So, you know, I talked to Johan about this. I was talking to me about this yesterday, guava, and he talks about guava bending over and touching the ground and raising right back up. You know, so guava, if you get the non-fruit varieties, are really, really good ornamental tree. You know, we don't see as many as we used to have on Trinidad, but this is where we want to, you know, explore that. But some of these trees are not good for, you know, for near houses. Acacia African tulip. African tulip would not be a tree you want near a house. It has all tree types. Stem failure in apple blossom. Black Olivier is okay. It has a small rate, but it fails all three. So you want to get a mix of trees as you put. A lot of these are forest species. But this gets to the point where you can analytically start to look at things on a tree and look at the species themselves. So this is a Brazil nut tree. It has a huge tree, big tree on near the Queen's Park Savannah, but it has a really good aspect ratio. You know, huge trunk to branch, huge trunk, big branches, but bigger trunks. So that's kind of what you want to look at. You know, this graph simply tells you in a tropical environment, this aspect ratio is hugely important. Hugely important. So the tree might look healthy to you, mightn't have any cracks or holes, but it's a hazard if it has a branch that's bigger. This is what it says. If that branch is bigger or about the same size as your trunk. So pay attention, and that is what you call overgrown, and that needs to be addressed. So in summary of, you know, tree and branch failure, I took this picture opposite Nelson Mandela Park, and I was happy to see the Maxi Taxi guy park and leave a space between him and the tree. And I said, wow. So the Corolla, I think on this end, or the Hyundai on this end, left some space. And then I see the AD wagon roll in, and I was like, oh my God, I didn't even know if the person would come out of it. But the AD wagon is right on the tree zone. You know, and this tree is suffering from compaction. This is, some of you may know it, Ping Pui, and it has a little bit of top down, dieback already starting on it. So no visible effects yet, but it's a hazard. It's going to be a hazard. Continue parking your trees there. I took this in 2017. So by now it's 4 years later. It's already starting to go downhill, and it's going to fall on the vehicles maybe one day, and then without warning, in inverted commas, it fell. All right, so this is my this is a way we can map trees in our urban spaces for trees that are a little more stable to put near building and structures and so forth. If you want to have a tree, you know, not up on a building, but within a respectable distance, you'd want to go for the green ones. And I would revisit the flamboyant, it's called a flame tree in Guam, because this is by nature a strong tree, but it succumbs to a lot of termite activity. If you wound it, you can get pathogens and so forth. So revisit that one. But the idea is you can take your urban forest and you can map it out where you have your green trees. So those of you in disaster preparedness, you can actually, and this is something I can help with. I'll be down in a few weeks. And this is something I'm working with you on is mapping and color coding. So imagine you lit up Port of Spain and or whatever corporation, you can actually highlight your trees so you know when you're going to have a high wind event, where to proactively start planning for your crews to be stationed or positioned. So we often go for desirable traits, nice color, this tree pretty too bad, but let's start to think about planning for stability. And then biomechanically, what we're seeing up north is these pruning cuts aren't healing because we don't have the dormant season we used to have here. So we have longer growing season, and when they make big cuts now, and this is in Philadelphia, trees fail. And this is just analyses of the branch aspect ratios to show that different trees behave differently in sort of groups. This is really just a table to show that you can actually have a stability score for the species developed. This is duck in Guam and the Saipan Island. We know it as breadfruit. So they have breakout strategies. When the wind hits it, the tree loses the tips, and then it can stay strong and survive the onset, and grow it back in no time. So that the tree has developed for high wind. So breadfruit trees are good. This is fire, I believe, and it's a tree endemic to the Pacific. Although I see specimens here and there in the Caribbean, you wonder about, some of these trees and the migration of trees sometimes. But this is a tree that has strong, really, really good for wind. Ironwood, we've seen some of it in Tobago. It grows in stands, and it lends itself stability by growing in stands. What we are seeing is a lot of vines on trees, and that is a hazard. So it's not a hole in the tree, but when you have a vine growing on a tree, that's a hazard, because that's going to add weight to the tree. It's going to cause that tree to have weight. So the ecologists are going to say, oh, the vines don't harm the tree. The thing is, they're going to affect the biomechanics of the tree. So it's like you growing up all your life, walking around with two limbs, two hands, and the weight of your hands, and you can swing your hands nicely, but then suddenly you had to wear 80-pound dumbbells in each hand and walk around. Suddenly you're not going to function right. And that's what happens when vines grow on trees and when rain falls on them. So vines are not a good thing sometimes. Urban group planting, this is a nice ecosystem type planting where you can host a larger tree with the likes of, some edible landscapes and so forth. This is what we used to do long ago in Trinidad, actually. But when we get happy with all the concrete pads and so forth, the construction, and we lost it. Now we want to instead of this, we want to put a single tree, and we want it to grow and provide shade for us. So the message is really, let's try to figure things out. So benefits of all the different fruits and color, think about establishment of the tree. Here in North America, we've seen plant migration. Vines have quadrupled in South America. They have in terms of population and in terms of biomass. So the vines in Costa Rica, for example, are now growing to be massive. They never got as woody as they are now. And one wonders, climate change is favoring the vines. I'm finding, I found this in Rhode Island last month. This is a vine from Mexico. It's a wild sweet potato that I discovered in a utility corridor up in Rhode Island. And heaven knows the birds are taking them and spreading all these vines around. And that's something that's going to happen. So with that, if you heard me say we during the presentation, it's not my multiple personalities. I referred to my team. I have a wonderful team in North America, and then I collaborate with a lot of fantastic people. Like I said, Johan Govaya over at Hot Services, and Rishi Singh, and the other folks at Forestry and Mishra Agriculture have always been huge, supporters and collaborators. This is Dr. Jim over in Guam with the last of a tree. So if you have ever seen that movie, what's it called, The Lorax? He's working on the last tree, and I'm helping him propagate the seedlings. I have a call with him tonight, and we're working on getting this tree species back on Guam. And this is some members of my team. But thank you for having me. I do appreciate what I can do on Trinidad. I carry a steel pan with me in my office and everywhere, and I tell people I'm a floating coconut. So with that, feel free to email me with questions. I'm on WhatsApp. That's my number. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Mr. Sankar.